In this video, we'll continue to look at the Eastern Theater in Virginia, but move a little bit later. We're going to look at the period in mid to late 1862 now. As the Peninsula Campaign played out in the spring and early summer of 1862, another campaign was taking place in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. General Stonewall Jackson, since earlier in the year, had been conducting a so-called Valley campaign. He had employed railroads and quick zigzagging movements and really confused the Union troops and drove them almost back up to the Upper Potomac region. Rumors circulated that Jackson was marching on Washington with 40,000 troops. There was panic in D.C. Lincoln didn't believe it, but he thought he saw an opportunity, and what he did, he decided, hey, he'd ordered troops away from the Peninsula Campaign, which I've already talked about, and they would come southward into the valley and also come into north from the valley and catch Jackson. Jackson would have mountains on the east and the west, and Union forces in the north and the south. So that was part of the reason that Lincoln ordered the troops away from the Peninsula Campaign. When Lincoln ordered McClellan to divert these troops in the Peninsula Campaign to defend Washington, he named General Urban McDowell, then a McClellan subordinate, to trap Jackson. The diversion of troops in the Peninsula Campaign probably didn't affect how that campaign went out. It probably wasn't going to capture Richmond anyway, but in the Valley, in a period of 1 month from May to early June 1862, Jackson's army of 17,000 men marched 350 miles, fought and won 4 battles, inflicted twice as many casualties as they suffered, and most notably occupied 60,000 Union troops. Jackson could not hold the Valley when Lincoln ordered the new federal troops in, but his army did become really quite famous. Jackson's Valley campaign is still studied in military schools as an example of how a small army utilizing geography and mobility can hold down and damage a much more powerful force. As McClellan returned to support General Pope near Washington after the end of the Peninsula Campaign, Lee, who was in charge with the Confederates now, set a trap for Pope outside Washington, very near Manassas, or the first Battle of Bull Run battlefield. And the result's going to be the second Battle of Bull Run in late August 1862. Lee ordered the Jackson troops to move northward, hoping to draw Pope out. And Jackson settled near Manassas, again, the town where the first Battle of Bull Run had been fought. Pope's Army of Potomac would then hopefully move westward from Washington to attack Jackson. Lee, however, had also quietly moved northward and ordered another Confederate general under General James Longstreet, shown here, to take up a position at the flank of Jackson's troops. When Pope, unaware of Longstreet's forces, attacked, Longstreet would counterattack at his flanks and break his army. Lee's trap worked. Pope was not aware of Longstreet's forces, and when Pope attacked Jackson, Longstreet attacked his flanks. The Second Battle of Bull Run was another horrible Union defeat. It began to build Lee's reputation, even as Lincoln quietly removed Pope from command of the Army of the Potomac and replaced him once again with McClellan. Lincoln still did not like McClellan, but saw at the time that he was the best choice. He had the most experienced general, so Lincoln swallowed his pride. In the end, Pope's Union army lost 14,000 men to Lee's 8,000 Confederates total. Here's a picture of some of the battlefield after the Second Battle of Bull Run. By 1862, as all this was unfolding, the possibility that Great Britain might recognize the Confederacy and use her Navy to help break the Union blockade was real. It's obviously something the Confederacy really wanted. Great Britain depended on Southern cotton exports, which had obviously been cut. Moreover, there had been several instances that exacerbated tensions between the United States and Great Britain, most notably the so-called Trent Affair in late 1861. Without authorization, a U.S. ship boarded the British mail packet Trent and found two Confederate diplomats, James Mason and John Slidell. Britain began to mobilize for a war because the U.S. had boarded their mail packet, and even sent troops into Canada as a band played on the British docks, Dixie. Lincoln was sort of in a predicament. He didn't want to look weak, but he didn't want Britain to enter the war either. Finally, Secretary of State Seward figured a face-saving way out. Released the two diplomats, but say it was because the seizing too closely resembled impressment by the British during the War of 1812, and so they could back their way out without with a little face saving. Another source of friction between the United States and Great Britain was the British constructing ships and selling them to the Confederacy. An official British law said constructing warships was illegal since they were neutral, but the U.S. complained that the British knew the Confederates could easily convert the ships into men of war. And so what they were doing is they were building these ships and then allowing the Confederates to easily convert them. During the war, one Confederate raider, the Confederate ship Alabama, shown here, was sunk in the English Channel in one of the few U.S. Confederate naval battles. It was all the way over around, as I say, in the English Channel. Here you can see a picture on board the Confederate ship Alabama. After the war, citing the ship Alabama, the U.S. struggled with Great Britain to get Britain to pay claims for the damage the Alabama and her raiders had earlier done. After the Battle of Second Bull Run, as I say, Lincoln had replaced Pope and put McClellan back in charge of defending Washington, D.C. Well, aware that the Britain might join the war, Lee started thinking that maybe if he could get a victory in the North, it might convince Britain to use their Navy to help the blockade. And it would demonstrate, kind of like Saratoga had in the American Revolution, that the rebels could win. And he also kind of hoped that his Confederate troops be welcomed as liberators by the secessionists in Maryland. So anyway, what Lee did was he did something very unconventional. It was a risky strategy, which is kind of classic Lee. He ordered Jackson to take the Harper's Ferry arsenal, which the Union troops had occupied, on the Potomac River. And that would be an escape route for another army that would be led by Longstreet that would pass over the Potomac River, bypassing Washington and into Maryland. And after taking Harper's Ferry, Jackson's troops would then join up with Longstreet and they would attack for a victory in Maryland. It was an aggressive strategy by Lee, as I say, but Lee assumed that McClellan would be slow to react, too hesitant to attack when the Confederates were divided and thus vulnerable. Lee's assumptions proved correct. McClellan waited fearfully, as Longstreet's forces crossed the Potomac, believing them a diversion, and he thought Lee was trying to pull him out of Washington so Lee could attack Washington. So he was hesitant to leave Washington, as Lee hoped. Unfortunately for Lee, his strategy was exposed in the famous Lost Order. Lee had sent an order which showed his plan, but a copy was apparently made by a courier. The courier wrapped it around 3 cigars to hide it. The original reached its designation, but the copy was captured by Union forces. Knowing that his order had reached its destination, but not aware of the copy, Lee was exposed, although he didn't know it. In the end, McClellan, having gotten the copy, decided to move out from Washington and attack Longstreet and Lee's forces. But unfortunately for McClellan, Jackson's forces had in fact joined Lee by that point that they met. When McClellan attacked, this became the Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg as it's sometimes called, September 1862. The famous Battle of Antietam, Maryland, sometimes called Sharpsburg, in mid-September 1862 was technically a draw. One's left to wonder, however, had McClellan moved faster, and caught Longstreet and Lee's forces before Jackson's forces at Harper Ferry had reinforced them, would the North have had a great victory and defeated Lee's army once and for all. At the end of the Battle of Antietam, Lee held the field, but McClellan called off the attack. Because his original plan had been blocked and he'd suffered such considerable losses, Lee then retreated back into Virginia. His army was intact, but he did not have that great victory on northern soil that he'd hoped for, and Britain didn't join the Confederacy. Antietam is famous for being one of the worst battles in American history, with September 16, 1862 specifically, one of the single bloodiest days in U.S. history. Of Lee's 40,000 troops, he lost over 10,000. Of McClellan's 75,000 troops, he lost 12,500. Several of the various charges and countercharges during the battle have become famous if you're a Civil War buff. For example, the cornfield. When U.S. troops advanced through a full cornfield, so many bullets were fired that it cut down the corn as well as the men. In one 20-minute span, the Union lost 2,000 men. That's approximately 2 men per second. Here you can see some of the dead at the cornfield at Antietam. In the middle of the battlefield, there was Dunkard Sect Church. You can see it here. A lot of fighting took place around there. It's also famous. Here's some of the dead at Dunkard Church. The Bloody Lane at Antietam is also infamous. You know, these dead are perfect for photographers because they didn't have to get in the battle. They could come out and they had enough time to expose their photograph. And of course, the dead didn't move. 2 weeks after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln decided to come out and visit McClellan's forces in Antietam to congratulate them for defending Washington, but also to get McClellan to be a little more aggressive. Here you see a picture of Lincoln posing with a couple of the generals near McClellan's command tent. Here's a famous picture of Lincoln meeting with McClellan in McClellan's command tent. And you see draped over the table behind Lincoln an American flag. This concludes the video on the Eastern Virginia campaign in mid to late 1862.